The newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GBNews, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show, live in Westminster. Thank you for joining me this morning. I've got lots on the show today, as is ever the case. I'm going to be speaking to George Eustice, who was Environment Secretary under Boris Johnson. I want to ask him about the government's net zero policies and are they just going to make the poor poorer and defeat the object entirely. I'm also going to be speaking to Labour peer Charles Faulkner about Keir Starmer's council tax plan and other matters. And I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by former Foreign Secretary Sir Malcolm Rifkind, who's going to be discussing Russia, China, and of course the story of the weekend, Donald Trump. Well, let's go through the stories of the weekend. I'm going to go through the newspapers with you now. Let's have a look at the front page of the Sunday Telegraph first. Staff can sue their boss if customers offend them. This is about a private member's bill that's been slipped through Parliament, I think on Friday, while no one was looking, that the Telegraph are very upset about. The Sunday Times, new nightmare for patients as strikes return. Yet again, more strikes in the NHS. The Observer. Care homes crisis. Children sent hundreds of miles away. This is about some children in care being sent up to 300 miles from where they are from. Sunday Mirror. Have a laugh at my funeral. This is apparently Paul O'Grady's final words to his best friend. The Sunday Express splashes with Rishi has 6 months to sort boats crisis. It's on his 5-point pledge plan. And the Mail on Sunday goes with vegan mob plans to sabotage the Grand National. It's about eco-warriors trying to get on the turf for that momentous moment up at Aintree later on this month. The Sun on Sunday, married England ace gags secret lover. Not named, but pictured in silhouette, so that will keep us guessing all day. And the Sunday People, Tories blow 8 million on King Charles pictures, which I believe we're going to be discussing in just a moment. Delighted to be joined now by Nigel Nelson, who's GB News' senior political commentator, newly coined, newly minted. I mean, before that, Nigel, you've spent 36 years covering politics, particularly for the People and the Sunday Mirror, so on the left side of things. And so it's interesting that you've chosen this interview that Sir Keir Starmer has done with the Sunday Times. What's he saying?
Well, the most interesting part about it, he's trying to address the transgender issue, which has been ripping the Labour Party apart.
Yes.
So he declares that 99.9% of women don't have penises,
right,
which was the question which caught him out before. Not quite sure that actually solves his problem at the moment.
No, it's not quite equivocal, is it? I mean, unequivocal, that, is it? 99.9%. Why is this such a sticking point with him? Why can't he just say that women don't have penises? I don't understand it.
Because he also believes in trans rights. So this is where he's got himself into a bit of a pickle. And I think the point he makes about it, which is true, is that the debate's become really toxic. And I think this applies to a lot of issues now, that we've got to a stage where debate becomes somehow paralysed. You're either on one side or the other, and don't brook anything in between. So a bit of that's to do with social media. I think there is still the division divisions existing over Brexit, which has actually helped that along. But it is a fair point that what he's saying is, look, we ought to actually be a bit more broad-minded about the whole thing. There are different points of view, but both sides ought to come a bit closer together.
But he's quite weather vanish on this, isn't he? I mean, we had last week him saying that he wanted to put a pause on kind of the Gender Recognition Act stuff and the Scottish stuff. Now Labour are coming out with tweets saying, you know, kind of banging the drum for their pro-trans stance. This is a problem with him because he's a bit difficult to pin down. He kind of stands for everything and nothing. You've been covering the political scene for all these decades, Nigel. How would you compare him to, say, Blair? And indeed, I know when you first started out in your career, you were covering Neil Kinnock a lot. Absolutely,
yeah. And so there is a huge difference between them. What you had with Neil Kinnock was a really charismatic leader. In fair dues to Keir Starmer, he's not that. Tony Blair had an underlying political philosophy which helped him win 3 elections. We don't see that with Keir Starmer. And he hasn't got the extraordinary stardust of Jeremy Corbyn. How Jeremy Corbyn got that, I never understood.
No.
But he very much had that kind of...
I think he might have lost his sparkle in recent days.
He may now, but at the time he was actually treated a bit like a rock star wherever you actually went with him. What you've got with Keir Starmer is someone who's terribly bright, he's very good company, he's competent, awfully cautious. So if you put him up against Rishi Sunak, you're almost choosing between 2 bank managers rather than some kind of political messiah. But maybe those qualities aren't a bad thing in a Prime Minister.
I was discussing this with Stephen and Angela earlier on breakfast. Is it a problem that people look at Starmer and think, well, actually, you're in the top 1% that Angela Rayner keeps on going on about. You're a very privileged lawyer. You had special arrangements for your pension. Why are you pretending to be a man of the people where you're just a kind of North London metropolitan elitist?
I think that when it comes to a Prime Minister, you can be a rich Prime Minister and you can be a poor one. That's the great thing about our system, that somebody like Rishi Sunak is a billionaire. I don't blame him for being that, and I don't think it disqualifies him from the job. It's something David Cameron said, why should I be disadvantaged in my career because of my background?
Yes.
So I think the same thing applies to Keir Starmer. You can still be a man of the people, even though you've been a successful man of the people.
Now, let's find out if you're a man of the people, Nigel. Because the Telegraph has identified a number of different political tribes. Hopefully we've got the graphic for this. And basically people are now being kind of put in different kind of categories. Are you a far left activist? Are you a rural righty? And the YouGov polling on this is really interesting because it's basically revealing that quite a lot of your traditional Conservative voters are going where?
They seem to be going to reform, which is interesting. So this is actually something done by the left-wing think tank Labour Together, and they've, as you said, have identified all these different groups, and the particular one is the rural right, as they call them. Now these are people who are dyed-in-the-wool Tory voters, now don't feel quite so confident about the Tories, and so reform would be the net beneficiary. Of course, the final beneficiary will be Labour.
Yes.
All that will happen, reform is unlikely to be able to get any seats in the same way that UKIP didn't. So what would happen is you'd split the Tory vote, especially in places like Red Wall or whatever, and Labour would come through the middle.
The trouble for reform is, with the greatest respect to Richard Tice, he isn't Nigel Farage of this parish, and therefore I think if Nigel said he wanted to go across and lead that party again, then the Conservatives would be much more worried. But they should be worried anyway if reform are creeping up to, 8 or 9%? Yeah,
they're going in that direction. And yet the Tories need to be worried. But you're right about somebody like Nigel Farage. I mean, he brought Brexit about. I mean, it was the major achievement, if you like, of this century politically. So, no, you haven't got a Nigel Farage there, but even he didn't get any MPs elected to Parliament.
Now, speaking of Farage, that then we can segue nicely into the Trump story. I do love the fact that the Mail on Sunday have mocked up what Trump's mugshot might look like.
It's good, isn't it?
The Donald's absolutely delighted with this coverage, isn't he, Nigel?
Yeah, he loves it. I mean, in typical Donald Trump fashion, his supporters are saying, oh, this is going to be the most famous mugshot in world history, which I presume will beat even Hugh Grant's mugshot, which was actually quite popular at the time. We have to wait till Tuesday to see how all this plays out. Unfortunately, we're not going to see Donald Trump in in handcuffs when he goes into court. But there you go. What it has done, obviously, is given his campaign a huge boost. His rhetoric, which was actually quite muted before this started, is now gearing up and is getting more intense, even a bit more on sort of the violent side.
Yes.
So I think that Donald Trump can't be upset about the fact that this is happening. He probably won't go to jail, but even if he did, he could actually serve his presidency.
He's got £4 million more quid in the coffers since this whole news story broke. We're going to be speaking to Lanny Davis, who is Michael Cohen's lawyer, a little later in the show to bring the viewers up to date and the listeners with the Trump story. Just a quick one on the picture of the weekend. Page 3 of the Mail on Sunday. It's Rufus Sewell as Prince Andrew. It's an uncanny likeness.
It's brilliant. I mean, in Victoria, Rufus Sewell looked like Rufus Sewell.
Yes.
But now you wouldn't recognise him, that he's slightly sort of jowly, he's got a bit of a paunch, but he looks exactly like Prince Andrew. And what Netflix are recreating is that famous walk with the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein through Central Park.
The Walk of Shame.
The Walk of Shame, and Rufus Sewell absolutely looks like the person he's playing.
Very quick last final royal story. King Charles. Should the Tories be blowing $8 million on King Charles pictures, Nigel?
Well, probably not. But I mean, what was interesting about this story is we always have pictures of the monarch up in various offices, council offices, government offices. No one's ever thought about who pays for them.
Yes.
Well, we do, and apparently they cost $8 million.
Probably a little bit too much expense in a time of straitened finances. Thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning, Nigel Nelson. You can catch him on other GB News programming. Now, Catherine Forster, news political reporter, is in St Albans, land of my father, where I went to school, where the Tominey City Ice's ice cream company may be well known to viewers and indeed People's panellists. Now, what do the People's Panel make of today's news? They know, I'm sure, that we've got George Eustice coming up. I'm going to be asking him about net zero. What does the panel think about that? What does the panel think about Trump? What does the panel think about Starmer? Catherine, what does the panel think about everything? Nice to see you this morning.
And you, Camilla. Yes, good morning and welcome to St Albans, which, as you've said, you know very well indeed. We're here in the Beach House with Alex. Alex, thank you very much for hosting us on the People's Panel this morning.
Good morning. Welcome to the Beach House from all of us at Oakman Group. We run 40 businesses around the UK.
Thank you so much for joining us on the People's Panel. Let's go and meet the rest of them. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning.
And good morning, Andy. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Right, so obviously lots of changes came in yesterday, changes for business, national living wage, energy support schemes, etc. Alex, tell us about the challenges that you're facing and what more support you would like to see businesses be given by the government.
Yeah, thank you very much. We've bounced back really well since COVID and really pleased with our sales. There have been a lot of challenges with energy pricing and some of the food input pricing that come in recent times, but what's fundamentally causing us the biggest issue is the level of taxation in our industry. It seems like the world has moved on, but the taxation system hasn't, and we need a bit more, I wouldn't say support around that, but we need a fairer system to help the hospitality industry thrive.
And what would you like to ask George Eustice?
Just like to ask what the government strategy is to help the hospitality thrive and maintain as a forefront of the UK and the world.
Thank you. Lots of challenges for businesses up and down the country, especially, as you say, ones with physical premises. And Steve, obviously Thursday was the government's Green Day, lots of policies announced about how we're getting to net zero. You have just bought a hybrid vehicle, but you've got some concerns, haven't you? Tell us about those.
Well, yes, I have. And the main one is that the range when the car is charged is pathetically low. It's about 20 miles, and which is just isn't enough. What that means is that we end up using the petrol power rather than the electricity power. And if the whole country is going to be doing this by 2030 or when we hit this target, then it's going to be a big problem. We don't have the infrastructure for charging in up and down the country. We can't repair the potholes. I don't see how we're going to get the charging spots up in place in time.
You've also got a question for George Eustice and a question about heat pumps as well, haven't you?
Yes, that's right. Political parties are always accusing each other of uncosted plans. I think that net zero is uncosted for the UK public. How much is it going to cost us to have a heat pump, to make the changes that we're going to be compelled to make in order to reach the net zero utopia?
Heat pumps are very, very expensive at the moment, aren't they? And Andy, you are a mortgage broker. You've previously always been a Conservative voter, but you're saying at the moment that you wouldn't vote for Rishi Sunak. Tell us why.
I blame Rishi Sunak for Boris's demise, and I think that's half the reason why the Conservatives are in the mess they're in at the moment.
Very succinctly put, but also you were talking more broadly that you feel the Conservatives aren't terribly conservative. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I think they've completely lost their core direction. They're not anymore the party of low taxation, and they're not recognised as running an efficient economy, and that's what we always used to do.
And what would you like to hear from Sir Malcolm Rifkind?
I would like to hear his ideas on, how can we get back to our core values? How can the Conservatives start doing what we want them to do?
So there you go, Camilla. Lots of questions for your guests. Look forward to hearing what they have to say. Back to you in the studio.
Thanks very much for that indeed, Catherine. Please do apply to the People's Panel next week. gbnews.uk/panel is the address. We're in St Albans. Actually, there's a piece in the Observer today saying that Stevenage woman is going to be dictating the next general election. They always say this. Mondeo man was one of them last time round. But I think it might be St Albans person. And that's why we're there. Now, George Eustace joins me now, former Environment Secretary and Tory MP for Cambourne and Redruth. Lovely to see you this morning, George.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for joining me on this rather gloomy Sunday. Let's get straight into sewage. And I'm asking you about that because our readers, particularly on The Telegraph, are absolutely furious at some of these figures. We learned that 1.75 million hours of 2022 was spent with water companies pouring raw sewage into our rivers. You were Environment Secretary. Did this happen on your watch? How has this happened? Why isn't this illegal?
Oh, this has happened for over 100 years, and it's a legacy, really, of the Victorian infrastructure that we've got on sewage. And actually, I was probably the first Secretary of State to really start to address this. When I became Secretary of State in 2020, I actually introduced a new spending review plan for Ofwat. They then required companies to start investing in this. It will take time. But last July, that culminated in a plan to reduce the use of storm overflows, significantly cutting them by about 25% over the next 2 to 3 years, and actually significantly reducing the harm altogether by 2050.
So are Ofwat, or indeed the Environment Agency, to be found wanting here? There's been a lot of criticism, particularly of the EA, when it comes to, say, not dredging rivers and contributing to flooding. From the punter's point of view, from listeners and viewers of this show, they'll be looking at this and going, this is just an absolute environmental scandal.
Well, there's two separate things that have been going on. First is on storm overflows, which is when you get a huge flood event, and to prevent the system being overwhelmed and sewage literally coming up through toilets into people's homes, which is what would happen, they have to have these emergency release overflows, which they use. Now, that's usually very diluted. In fact, often it's just street drainage. It's water that's come off the streets rather than the foul water system. That's one thing. That's always been part illegal and part of their permits, but there's a question about whether the EA were monitoring those permit conditions properly, and that's being investigated now. And there's a separate problem, which is some sewage companies were releasing treated sewage, but slightly prematurely. And that is another issue. We don't know whether that's because the water companies themselves hadn't realised that and hadn't detected it, but it has now been detected, and that's also subject to an investigation in some cases.
So is it just that we have to put up with the fact that sewage in some form or other is always going to be released into our rivers?
Well,
it's always been thus, and therefore it always will be thus.
Well, the use of these storm overflows, although the headline figures announced this week sound high, it's been reducing for 4 years. It dropped dramatically last year, partly due to drier weather, it has to be said. But we have a plan to reduce the harm from these by 25% by 2025. And then beyond that, £56 billion of investment that's already started to be spent is going to effectively reduce the harm from these storm overflows by 2050. I think you're always going to need some of them, because to eliminate them altogether, you need to spend about £600 billion on our sewage infrastructure, and that's actually disproportionate to the problem. And if you spent £600 billion on that, you would see water bills probably treble, and you actually wouldn't see a corresponding environmental impact.
You seem to be saying that this isn't too much as a problem, and you've then got campaigners like Fergal Sharkey sort of tearing their hair out. We've got people writing into their droves thinking that it really is a massive problem.
Well, it's not a new problem, so it's been a problem
a problem even if it's
been a problem down the decades. It's something that we've been addressing. Sewage infrastructure, these are long-term challenges, and yes, I know that people want an instant solution. We've given them an instant solution in the case that there was a plan last July, £56 billion to be spent on it, but it will take 3 years to get a 25% reduction and probably 10 years to get it down further. That people just have to accept that it takes a bit of time, and then it's not a new problem.
OK. Should people swim in our rivers?
Yes,
and
they do. And they do. Yes, they do.
Brimming with sewage?
No, they're not. So these tend to be releases that happen at the point at which you get severe storm overflows. We do have ways of, we have bathing water quality beaches that are designated as such, and we started to designate bathing water quality in rivers as well. And there has been an improvement in water quality in rivers in recent decades.
The government this week has announced its plans on net zero and that they're going to continue with this target. I think there's a great deal of concern among the GB audience that it's actually going to cost them more money, not least if they have to start replacing diesel and petrol cars for very costly electrics, if they're going to have to start getting a heat pump. Prices for those start at £8,000, I believe. What's your view on all this? I mean, is environmental policy fit for purpose if it makes the poor poorer?
I think even if you, and there are people who are sceptical about the need and wisdom of going for net zero by 2050, I happen to support it. But even for those who don't, there's an energy security issue here as well. We probably passed peak oil about a decade ago, and that means that resources of oil and gas are going to be diminishing.
Although there's this new oil field, apparently, oil field that's being built, is it Rosemond, which is going to apparently blow the complete carbon reduction budget for the government?
Well, what I would say is there's a role definitely for gas in the transition because it's central to get what we call blue hydrogen. And hydrogen is going to be an important fuel to use for particularly lorries, heavy goods vehicles and some other purposes as well. But, oil is a diminishing resource. It's increasingly going to be in the hands of regimes that we can't trust, as we've seen in the last year. And therefore, you've got to, as a point of energy security, have a strategy to reduce your reliance on fossil fuels.
But the EU have put a pause on their plans to try and cut out fossil fuels. They've said, look, this is just not practicable because of the war in Ukraine, because of surging energy prices. In the UK, people are seeing their energy bills go up. Now they're going to be potentially having to pay more for their cars in future, going to have to ditch cars with scrappage schemes that don't seem to give them the money that they deserve. 5 minutes ago, we're told to drive diesels. The next, we're told to abandon them. You can understand the frustration of the UK taxpayer on this. Stealth taxes put into their energy bills because of green levies that they have no control over. And actually, our emissions are 1% of the world's carbon emissions. So we're all doing the right thing. What difference does it make if China and Russia keep on belching out emissions like Billio?
Absolutely, and that's right. It's a global endeavour, and that's why the COP event that we have, although people will criticise that, is absolutely necessary to get the rest of the world to act as well. But, my view on this is when it comes to vehicles, it would be new sale vehicles only. So there'll still be a second-hand market for petrol and diesel cars for some years to come.
But electric cars, have you got an electric car?
I haven't, no, because for me at the moment it doesn't work because I sometimes have to make a very long journey to Cornwall. It doesn't
work for many people,
exactly,
does it?
And that's
why is the government pushing it then?
Well, that's why you can still get petrol and diesel vehicles at the moment. The reason it doesn't work is the technology is not quite there to deal with the range, and the infrastructure for charging is not quite there.
It's only till 2030. That's 7 years away.
Exactly, and a lot can happen in 7 years. Look at what's happened in the last 7 years. It was inconceivable you would have had any electric vehicles. Now a significant number of those sold.
But the Europeans aren't phasing out theirs, so why are we doing it?
Well, the government still judges, and they've obviously looked at this, that it's right to keep that target in place, and it would be premature to make a change to that at the moment. I think if you get that infrastructure in place and you send a clear,
but isn't
consistent...
it just punishing poor people?
No, it's not, because most poor people actually would buy a second-hand car. And
there are no second-hand electric cars available right now.
No, but there are second-hand diesel and petrol cars, and will continue to be for many years to come. You're only talking about new sales of cars that would be phased out by 2030.
What about heat pumps? Do you think poor people can afford to change their boiler and spend £8,000 minimum on one?
Now, on this, I've argued a change and will be seeking to amend the energy bill when it comes back to the House of Commons, because we've got a lot of off-grid gas properties or properties that use typically kerosene heating oil, and you actually can make an adaptation to those existing boilers so that they will run on something called hydro-treated vegetable oil, which
this is your private member's bill.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, this is a good idea. This is a practical solution. So people who can heat their homes with vegetable oil should get VAT reductions.
Exactly. And for a small cost of a couple of £100, they can make an adaptation to their existing boiler, and then we can get nearly a 90% reduction in carbon very quickly. So I'm hoping the government will take this up, because my view is you shouldn't
Instead of heat pumps?
Yes, because an air source heat pump will be right for some properties, but not for many. They tend to need a lot of insulation, and if you've got old cottages, insulation means less ventilation, that means mould and damp and so on. So it's not the right technology for some of these older properties.
So the Energy Secretary, Grant Shapps, says he's going to get a heat pump. Is he wrong to do that? Is that a stupid idea because they're not fit for purpose?
No, it'll be right for some homes, and ground source heat pumps could work really well on what's called district level heating, where you take a whole estate and move it on to a ground source heat pump. There's a role for air source heat pumps with some individual properties, but I actually think for those so-called off-gas grid properties that currently use kerosene predominantly, we actually should enable them at very low cost to adopt to a renewable heating fuel that would actually reduce carbon far faster than trying to require them to have an air source heat pump.
Can I talk to you about the CPTPP, which is the new trade deal that's been signed in the South Pacific?
Yeah.
You were quite scathing about Liz Truss on trade deals. Do you regret that now? She's done quite well, hasn't she? Followed up by Kemi Badenoch?
Well, no, Kemi Badenoch has done reasonably well on this.
Why won't you credit Truss with this?
Well, because all she did was, on CPTPP, was, to be honest, send the letter saying she would like to join. There weren't really any...
do you not think she was a very good trade secretary, then?
I was critical of what was done on the Australia trade deal. And the reason I was critical is I wanted the government to learn the lessons. And the lesson is that in a trade agreement, any trade agreement...
Yeah. The negotiation of this deal has been going on for 2 years, though, hasn't it? And she was trade secretary and she was foreign secretary and she was Prime Minister.
Well,
so you don't give her any credit at all?
The big decisions on this were starting to be only just about made in around July, when Anne-Marie Morris was there and Liz Truss actually had been out of the role for about 6 months.
You were worried about the Australian deal, but won't this also mean that cheap meats get imported into the UK and flood the British market?
No, because you've got limits on this. So my criticism of the Australia deal was that it was very one-sided. It gave full liberalisation when we should have had what's called an enduring TRQ, and that's a TRQ is a fixed volume of product that you allow in. What they've done on the CPTPP is secured a much more balanced reciprocal exchange of opportunities with fixed volumes within parameters.
So no credit to Truss at all? Do you just not really like Truss?
I've supported Liz Truss on lots of things and worked
not
with
this,
her.
Though.
I disagreed with the approach she took on the Australia trade deal, and I've been very honest about that. I think sometimes ideological views about
Why didn't you resign over it at the time, then, if you were that opposed to it?
Because I secured a termination clause in the Australia trade deal, which means any government in future can terminate the agreement with 6 months' notice in writing. That was important, a very important safeguard, given the lack of others. And I also managed to secure staging over 15 years, which wasn't ideal, and I would have held out for way more.
But you think this is a decent deal, just to
I think this is a reason. This is a balanced reciprocal exchange of opportunities with the right kind of safeguards, and that's what a trade deal should be. It shouldn't be some ideological approach that says we want to liberalise for the sake of it.
No.
It is a balanced exchange with other countries that are also looking after their interests.
George Eustace, thank you for joining me this morning.
You.
Lovely to see you. Lots more to come on today's show, including I'm going to be speaking to Labour Lord Charlie Faulkner about Keir Starmer and other matters. I'm also going to be speaking to former Foreign Secretary Sir Malcolm Rifkind. And the lawyer of Michael Cohen, the man at the heart of the Donald Trump indictment scandal, is going to be joining me a little later on in the show. See you very shortly. Here's the news headlines.
I joined GBNews because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GBNews is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GBNews is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GBNews, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories, controversies and issues.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
It's 5 times the opinion, 5 times the debate, and 5 times the fun. The Saturday 5. Saturday nights from 8. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
You could wink at the end. I can't Britain's wink. Listening.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Good morning, it's 1 minute past 10. I'm Tatiana Sanchez. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The Port of Dover has run extra ferry services overnight to try and clear a backlog which has seen passengers delayed for up to 14 hours. The port declared a critical incident yesterday as traffic built up for the Easter getaway, with coaches at the cruise terminal facing the longest waits. Ferry services have cited bad weather and hold-ups at French border control, with the port saying additional coach bookings had impacted operations. Travel expert Simon Calder told us it's been miserable overnight for thousands of people.
After Brexit, we asked for tougher checks. So when you turn up at Dover, previously you just sort of waved the passport out of the window and that would be fine. Now we asked to be treated as third country nationals. So an officer is supposed to go through the passport, checking all your stamps. They then need to stamp the passport themselves, and that takes much, much longer than it did previously. Multiply that by 50 or 60 people on board a coach, and you get delays.
The Home Secretary is to introduce new measures to tackle child sexual abuse. Writing in the Mail on Sunday, Suella Braverman has announced those working with children will have a legal duty to report signs or suspicions of sexual abuse. It follows an independent inquiry last year which described sexual abuse of children as an epidemic. 3 British men are being held in Taliban custody in Afghanistan. They include the so-called danger tourist Miles Routledge, who had to be rescued from Kabul by British forces less than 2 years ago. A humanitarian network that's assisting 2 of the men says it believes they're in good health and are being treated well. Anthony Joshua has won his heavyweight fight against Jermaine Franklin. The British boxing champion put in a somewhat laboured display at the O2 Arena in London last night, securing a unanimous points victory in 12 rounds. It's Joshua's first time back in the ring since losing to Alexander Usyk last August, earning him his 25th professional win. And the Pope has opened Easter celebrations in Rome by attending a Palm Sunday service the day after being sent home from hospital with bronchitis. Pope Francis was driven to St. Peter's Square in the Vatican City, sitting in the back of an open-topped car as it passed through the crowds. The 86-year-old was taken to hospital on Wednesday, complaining of breathing difficulties, but returned home to the Vatican yesterday. TV, online, DAB Plus Radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's back to Camilla.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. In just a moment, I'm going to be speaking to Labour peer Charles Faulkner. I'm also going to be speaking to the former Foreign Secretary, Sir Malcolm Rifkin, to get his take on Donald Trump, the post-Brexit trade deal, the situation in Israel. And later on in the show, I'm going to be speaking to the lawyer representing Michael Cohen, who's the man at the heart of the Donald Trump indictment scandal. So a lot more to come. First of all, though, let me introduce you to now Lord Charlie Faulkner, who's the Labour peer and former Justice Secretary. Lovely to see you, Charlie, if I may call you that.
Of course.
As familiar as we are with each other.
Yeah.
Now, let's get started on Sir Keir Starmer's council tax plan.
Yeah.
This is intriguing me. He wants to freeze council tax. He's not yet in government. But at the same time, he's perfectly happy for Labour-run councils across the country to be putting up council tax bills by 5%. He's even quite happy in this great capital city for Sadiq Khan to be putting them up by almost 10%.
Well, he's saying he would freeze council tax because he understands that people are suffering in the cost of living.
But why don't Labour, if Labour councils share his ethos and he is the leader of the party, why are they putting council tax up?
Well,
and why could we trust him on this when we know that Labour councils put council tax up?
He's describing what Labour would do if they were in central government, and they would freeze council tax and they would make money available from a windfall tax. And
but
this
the
is a
proof of the pudding
recognition
is in
of
the
what
eating.
people...
Well, the Welsh Labour don't cut council tax, they put it up. Labour's in charge of London. They've put council tax up by 10%. The average, apparently, of Labour-run councils, of which I believe the shadow cabinet, most of them, the 2/3 of them are in these councils, they've put council tax up by 5%. So we can't really believe what he's saying on this, John.
Well, I think you can, because the reason why council tax has gone up in all of those councils over the last few years is because of the freeze and squeeze from central government. What Keir is saying is if we were in government, we would freeze council tax, we would make available the gap that would cause, because we understand what people have gone through over the last few years. It's been an absolute nightmare because of the way central government has squeezed money and forced councils, Labour and Conservative, to increase council tax. And what Keir is saying is we can remove that burden, not all of it, but we can stop it going up and we can increase the expenditure that will be available from central government because of the windfall tax. Now, it makes sense.
How much is this windfall tax paying for? Like, literally every Labour policy seems to be costed according to the windfall tax. Oh, we want to do this. The windfall tax is paying for it. We want to freeze council tax. The windfall tax is paying for it. Is this all being properly costed? Where can we see all of the calculations on this chart?
It has all been properly costed. And
Right.
if you'd like to invite Mr. Pat McFadden, the Chief Secretary of the
I've had him on the show before. He's welcome. Pat, you're welcome. Come back on.
And he will explain to you that it is all properly costed. But surely, in the context of the world in which we're living at the moment, central government has got a role in relation to this. And what's more, should some of the burden be carried by the energy companies that have made a huge amount of profit from the increase in energy taxes?
Yeah, but at the same time...
Labour takes the view, and just let me finish this point, Camilla. Labour takes the view the burden should be shared, and those with the broadest shoulders should carry as much as their broad shoulders should allow.
And yet, at the same time, Labour is very aggressively pursuing their own net zero strategy. They want the government to go quicker on this.
Yeah.
I've just been speaking to George Eustace about it. Net zero strategies just make the poor poorer. It's the same with this ludicrous ULEZ, which again a Labour mayor is foisting on people, hard-working people of this city. It costs the poorer more money. So it's not the broadest shoulders accepting this stuff, is it, Charlie? It's people who are driving white vans, it's nurses, it's junior doctors. Apparently all of their public sector pay rises are going to be wiped out by this ULEZ. So which is it? What does Labour stand for?
Let's take London to start with. If government, central government, was not so harsh on, for example, public transport, there would be much cheaper public transport. The reason why people have to use their own vehicles is because of central government's real down on London's public transport policy, for example.
But is the ULEZ going to change the world's temperature?
ULEZ is going to make the world safer over the long term.
But we all... How can we need to have a ULEZ when you're already saying that you support the policy of eradicating petrols and diesels? Ergo, if I may use that rather Jacob Rees-Moggian term.
Therefore, yes.
Therefore, air pollution is going to decrease at the very moment that you're charging people. Also, there are people who have got first-hand experience of ULEZ and indeed LDNs saying that it's now taking them 2 hours to do a journey that should have taken 20 minutes. All the time they're doing that, they're pumping fumes out of their cars.
Oh, no, that's completely wrong. First of all, the LDNs, the amount of fuel being discharged into the atmosphere in the LDNs is now very, very much less.
LDNs blocked 240 ambulances in the last...
So you're constantly changing your position.
My position is LDNs aren't a good thing and ULEZ isn't a good thing.
Well, I'm in favour of them both. LDNs because they reduce the amount of traffic, ULEZ because they reduce the amount of pollution. And both of those things we need to address.
But both of them affect the poor badly.
Well,
both of them disproportionately affect the poor. People trying to get around to frontline jobs. And with the ULEZ, people who can't afford to pay £12.50 a day to drive in London, even if they have no choice.
First of all, LDNs... in no way damage public transport. Indeed, they make public transport easier. Secondly, in relation to ULEZ, yes, there are some people who have to pay more, but the effect overall will be to reduce pollution, and that is a worthwhile thing to do.
Let's talk about the CPTPP. Why is Keir Starmer talking this trade deal down? It's good, isn't it, that we've now in a trading relationship with 500 million people in the Indo-Pacific?
I don't know the detail of that, so be careful on what I say. But I think the point that Keir is making is that in relation to many of those trade deals, they already existed. So yes, we're in favour of lots and lots of trade all over the world. But in relation to over-claiming as a government, what further progress has been made. I think the point that Labour is making is this is being rather over-exaggerated in terms of what the change was.
Labour's talking about ever closer alignment with Europe economically, but by 2050 we understand that the European Union will account for just 1/10 of the world economy and the CPTPP will account for almost 1/4. So Labour are running after the wrong people, aren't they?
I don't think quote, running after the wrong people is the right way to look at it. Surely we're all in favour of as much trade as possible.
So you should be really heavily in favour of the CPTPP.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the point that Keir is making is not we're not in favour of it. We're very,
He's talking it down, isn't he? He's going on about it only representing 0.08% of trade.
We're very keen to have as much trade as possible. The question is, does this represent a massive change? But like you say, Camilla, I'm all in favour of lots of trade. I'm also all in favour of lots of trade with Europe. I hope you are as well.
We all are, I'm sure. Well, we do have an FTA with the EU, don't we? Should China be blocked from membership of the CPTPP? According to Liz Truss, they should.
I'm not sure about that. I don't have a view that would, I mean, you've got Malcolm Rifkin coming. You've had George Eustice.
I'm intrigued by your view on it, Charlie.
I'm rather neutral on that at the moment because I'm not really sure what I want to express a view on things I know a little bit about, and I don't.
How about men and women? Let's discuss that. Okay. Now, do you agree with Keir Starmer that 99.9% of women don't have a penis?
Yes.
OK, so that 0.1%... why are Labour sort of tying themselves slightly in knots over this? Why can't he just say that women don't have penises biologically?
Well, obviously biologically that's right, but we're in favour of trans women having rights and being protected. I completely agree with Keir and with you, Camilla. It's a very small proportion
Do you
of
agree
people.
with self-identification, though, without any medical certificate?
I do, yes.
Oh, so you're in line with Nicola Sturgeon up in Scotland?
I am in line
Are
with
you?
that.
And why is that? Because people find that quite a scary policy. They think that it's going to lead to situations like Isla Bryson up in Scotland being put in a woman's prison estate. They worry about that then leading to sort of men who are posing as transgender, but perhaps to try and evade criminal justice system, ending up in women's toilets, women's changing rooms, and all the rest of it. They're legitimate concerns, aren't they?
They are completely legitimate concerns. The reason I'm in favour of self-identification is because I think if you are, for example, a trans woman, then broadly you should be allowed to live as a trans woman. I also think that, as far as I can see, the vast majority of people who are trans women are completely genuine.
But what about those who are gaming the system? Because it does happen.
Yes, exactly. I'm sure it does. And in those circumstances, you need proper risk identification. I mean, the example of Isla Bryson, a completely unchanged man who had committed rapes very recently, the idea of that person going into a women's prison is frankly ridiculous, and you need proper risk identification to stop that ever happening. And indeed, the way a sensible prison service would operate would make sure that that didn't happen. And it's nothing to do with whether or not they've got, for example, a trans woman certificate. It's to do with what are the risks to all those other people who are in a women's prison. So I've got absolutely no problem about there being sensible means to protect women against people like Isla Bryson. Okay. But I'm sympathetic to trans women and making sure that they are protected, because people who've dealt with this issue...
But women's rights also need protecting,
Of course they do, yes,
okay.
And I completely accept that.
Lord Faulkner, thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Couldn't have been over so quickly.
Indeed, it's gone very quickly, but thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Let me now read out a few of your GB views, as we like to do on this show. Let's see what Neil says. Neil says, Starmer's latest definition of a woman is that 99.9% don't have a penis. Doesn't this just show that he's a bit silly? Well, Lord Faulkner disagrees with that. Susan says, on the back of the Telegraph piece we were talking about with Nigel, yes, we were talking about different political tribes and whether people are going to be giving their vote to Reform next time round. We are Conservatives forever. We have now joined Reform. Our Labour friends have joined too. Maybe the Red Wall will go to Reform next. I would imagine that the Conservatives think not or hope not. And Nigel says, like all other utilities companies, water company bosses couldn't care less about the UK environment. That was in response to my chat with George Eustace just now about the sewage that keeps on being pumped into our rivers. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Sir Malcolm Rifkind in the studio, who was Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretary in John Major's cabinet. It's a great week to have you on, Sir Malcolm. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Now, let's talk first of all about Trump, if we may, because it is the story of the weekend. As you well know, there's a mocked-up mugshot of the former US president in the Mail on Sunday. Do you think that if this legal process goes ahead, that he should still run for US president?
Well, that's clearly not a matter for a British commentator as to whether he ought to or not.
You might voice an opinion, I thought, with all of your wealth of political experience.
From the perspective of any candidate, if he's in the circumstances he is in the moment, he's got to come to a judgment. Is this actually going to help his campaign or not? And Trump is a pretty unattractive character, much more than he was 8 years ago, even without this indictment. But to have a criminal indictment, because this isn't just a one-day event, this is going to dominate the headlines for the next few weeks, possibly, almost certainly the next few months. And even people who think that he shouldn't have been charged will forget whether he should or shouldn't have been. The whole subject will be former president in court day after day, defending himself on a criminal charge.
But do you think it's an own goal then for the so-called left-leaning lawyers? The whole city of New York seems to have wanted to get Trump, and now they've got him, because he's now got another, I think it's $4 million in the coffers. He's become a poster boy for kind of, you know, a witch hunt of the right. Actually, it's emboldened his campaign.
Well, first of all, this isn't the only indictment he's likely to face. There are 3 or 4 other investigations going on at the moment. And I think it's a bit difficult to just assume that there's a political purpose behind them. The United States prosecution system can sometimes, one suspects, be influenced by political considerations. But here you have a unique situation of a president when he was in office, and it's not so much this charge, it's a question, for example, did he incite people to try and break the law to declare that the election had been invalid? Was he involved in the riots in the capital? Now, these will be even more serious, and the very fact that he's having to face these kind of accusations, in my judgment, if you're asking me, it should prove to anyone who had any doubts how totally useless and dangerous he would be if he was again to become president of the United States, not just for the Americans, but for the world as a whole.
Talking about the US presidential race, we now hear that Biden is seriously considering running for a second term. That will mean he's 86, I believe. Is that just a term too many for Biden?
Well, it is extraordinary that in a country of, 300 million people, they have to have as the two possible presidential candidates, one in his 80s and one who will be in his 80s if he was to succeed. So it is about time, I would have thought, as an external friend of America and observer, it really is about time both the Democrats and the Republicans look to the next generation. I mean, I find myself now in my mid-70s being ridiculously underused, when if only I was an American, I might have been about to enter the White House.
You would be at the prime of your career. So
well, the future would not be what it used to be.
But it is a bit of a Hobson's choice, isn't it? And do you think that does have a destabilising effect on the rest of the world?
Well, only in the sense that it creates maximum uncertainty.
Yes.
Because, I mean, if it's Biden versus Trump, I hope to God it's Biden who wins. But you never know, will he be able to complete his term? Not just will he be alive. I mean, maybe he just would become so ill because of some other problem that he'd have to hand over. So the choice of vice president then becomes crucially important. Kamala Harris, the current vice president, is not seen as a very strong holder of that office. But will it be possible to have a new candidate? And if so, who might that be?
Let's talk about Russia now. Yesterday, they took on ownership of the leadership of the UN Security Council.
Yes.
That will strike many people as ridiculous and preposterous.
Yes, I agree with them if they feel that, but don't read too much into that.
Right.
The person who chairs the Security Council literally does no more than that. They don't decide the outcome. And you have 5 permanent members.
It's not great optics, though, is it?
Well, there are various things about it. It's not very the optics of having a president in the Kremlin who has invaded his neighbouring country and caused total carnage and hundreds of thousands of loss of lives and people injured, of his own citizens as well as Ukrainians. That's not very good optics either.
Quite.
So compared with that, I don't frankly care who chairs the Security Council. It's a temporary thing. It goes in rotation. It's what the Security Council does or doesn't do that is much more important.
And do you have a view on China being blocked from any participation in this new CPTPP deal?
I'd better ask you to repeat the initial.
I know.
No,
don't even think about it. This has been bugging me all morning.
Yes, you're talking about.
Should we just say the deal?
You're talking about the
Asia-Pacific trade deal that we've done. And Liz Truss has said China shouldn't be a part of this.
Well, the irony is that this organisation was created as a counter to Chinese expansion. Because one of the foolish things that Xi Jinping has done, he's a very, in many ways, a very impressive guy, but his strategic judgment is useless. Because his main target, as we all know, is Taiwan.
Yes.
And he would admit that. And yet what does he do? He has, over the last 3 or 4 years, forget America, forget Europe, forget even Australia, he's alienated every one of his Asian neighbours, Japan, India, Vietnam, the countries of Southeast Asia, by having territorial claims on them as well, and by taking them forward. So here you have someone who has managed to unite all the Asian neighbours, so that Vietnam, think of the history of Vietnam and America. Vietnamese minister recently said, today America is our partner.
Yes.
China is the country we're worried
Extraordinary.
about. India, which during the Cold War always was non-aligned. We don't take sides. India has just joined what's called the Quad with the United States, Japan and Australia to discuss how to contain China. Now, these things would not have happened but for the foolish judgments made by Xi Jinping, who's a bit like Putin in that sense. He has got so much power, he doesn't listen to anybody else. And just as he mucked up China's handling of COVID, he's mucked up their foreign policy as well. And that's serious stuff.
What was your reaction to those two meeting a couple of weeks ago? I mean, does that tell us anything new that we didn't know already?
Well, it's a very interesting question you're asking me, because you see, what is presented by both of them, Putin and Xi Jinping, we're allies, we're close chums, we are inseparable. And to some degree, that is true. They're both authoritarian leaders who dislike the West, who dislike the United States, and are trying to create an alternative. But the Chinese are much smarter than the Russians, because when it comes to it, when the United Nations votes to condemn Russian invasion of Ukraine, China doesn't vote for that motion, but doesn't vote against it either.
Yes.
It abstains.
Yes.
Now, that's not what your best chum should be doing. And China has, for example, also refused to recognize Putin's annexation of these various parts of Ukraine as if they're now part of Russia. He won't do that. And we also know that Xi Jinping was one of the people, very important here, that got through to Putin saying, under no circumstances threaten the use of nuclear weapons.
Yes.
Because we will not support you. And the reason they won't support them is not just because they are trying to be helpful to Ukraine. It's because the Chinese are very worried if you have a precedent, for the first time since Hiroshima, of a non-nuclear weapon state being threatened by a nuclear state, then guess what will happen on China's border? Japan, South Korea, Taiwan will say, well, if you need nuclear weapons to defend yourself from your big neighbour, maybe we should start thinking.
But then it sounds to me as if you're nearing the position of Russia sort of being a client state of China's. I mean, it's not quite that pronounced,
It's not a client state, but the Russians have to be very, very careful, because as a result, for example, again, Putin's stupidity, their biggest market for their gas was Germany and Europe. That's now gone. 100% of it will be gone in literally weeks from now. It will never come back. Now, when you're dealing with gas, it's not like oil. Oil you can sell, put it on a ship. You can take it anywhere and sell it at a discount. Gas needs pipelines. There aren't any pipelines at the moment. There won't be for 10 years.
Are you happy with the government's rhetoric on China, though? The Integrated Review refresh of 2023 has said that China poses an epoch-defining challenge. Is that strong enough language?
Actually, yes, I think it is. It's a good question, and let me answer it. I think you still have to make a very clear distinction between how we deal with Russia for the time being, because of the invasion of Ukraine, and China. Russia has actually invaded its neighbour, causing it's in the middle of a huge war against its neighbour who is trying to defend itself. Xi Jinping might do that against Taiwan. He's not done it yet. And therefore, China is hugely important. I have always taken the view, even with Russia, that you are not making a concession by dialogue. You have to have dialogue, but in the case of China also, China, unlike Russia, is massively integrated in the global economy.
So do you think Liz Truss was too hawkish?
I think her language was too hawkish. I don't think the policy changed. Well, she only had 46 days. Limit to what you can do in 46 days.
As Foreign Secretary, I suppose.
But the language, I think there is a tendency, it's become sort of the norm, to be hawkish on China. Well, it depends what you mean by hawkish. If it means you've got to talk tough about what happens if China attacks its neighbours, not just Taiwan, but also India, also other countries that have territory that it claims. You've got to be very tough on that. But if is it too late to have a proper cooperative relationship with China on other matters? For example, on climate change, on nuclear weapons, on environmental issues. There's a range of issues where if the Chinese wish to, which they probably do, there can not only be dialogue, but you could actually make some serious progress.
I want to ask you about Israel in just a moment, but just briefly, General Sir Richard Barrons has talked this week about Britain needing to have 5 to 10 years' notice from Vladimir Putin should he wish to stage a Russian attack. Are we adequately defended in this country? The spending for defence has gone up to, I think, 2.25 of GDP. People wanted 3%.
Well, you're speaking to a former defence secretary, so I don't object if the defence budget is increased. I think that would be very desirable. But if you're asking me a more fundamental question, does Russia pose a military threat?
I think more of a question of, is Britain adequately defended, or have we actually depleted our armed forces to too much of an extent?
Well, we have the 5th largest defence budget in the world. So compared to the vast majority of countries, we certainly spend a lot more on defence than most of the world does. Only United States and China spend more than we do.
So are we spending enough?
Well, what does enough mean? I was going to make the point. If the Russian government, under Putin, has shown himself to be useless at trying to defeat Ukraine, next door, a much weaker country, a much smaller population, the idea that Russia could defeat NATO. The defence budget of NATO is 10 times greater than that of Russia. Its armed forces are infinitely more sophisticated. And if the Russians cannot even make progress a few miles in the Donbass, the idea that they could sweep across Europe is absurd.
Quick
That doesn't
word
mean, sorry, forgive me.
Yes.
That doesn't mean you don't have to have strong defence.
Sure.
You have to do it to stop them trying to exploit gaps in your defence that could create problems for the Baltic states or for other countries.
And a quick word on Israel, Sir Malcolm, because I know you wanted to talk about that, these protests against these judicial reforms,
Yes.
which I think Netanyahu has now backed down on slightly, but it's not
For
a good
the time
situation.
being.
What's your view on that?
Well, some people say democracy is under threat around the world. What has been extraordinary and very encouraging in Israel is that when there was a comparable threat, and there may still be one, from Netanyahu's government, we have over 1 million Israelis, not just once, day after day, week after week, over the last 2 months, coming out in vast numbers, and the government has to bend the knee. Now, that shows that although Israel has big problems at the moment, it's not one of those countries where the government can ignore civil liberties, ignore the rule of law, and seem to get away with it.
And that's probably encouraging.
That's hugely encouraging, not just for Israel, but it shows that civic society, ordinary people who value their freedom, who value the rule of law, can combine and prevent even what seems to be the most powerful government from achieving its objective. Now, the Israel story is not yet finished, but so far, it's the people of Israel who are winning, and it's the government that are losing.
Sir Malcolm Rifkin, thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Thank you very
Lovely
much.
to speak to you. Now, Michael Portillo, another former Defence Secretary and GB News presenter, joins me now. His show is coming up at 11 o'clock. I'd love to know what you make of my interview just now with your former colleague.
Well, it was a marvellous advertisement for a commentator in his mid-70s, because we were talking about age in the context of the United States. And Malcolm is incredibly lucid and a very great commentator. He's left some of his diplomacy behind, saying very clearly that he thought that a Trump victory would be dangerous, saying as a British Conservative that he would like to see Biden win the election, and referring to both Putin and Xi Jinping as being stupid. So it wasn't the most diplomatic interview that I've ever heard, but I thought it was full of truths. And is it not very interesting that even a Conservative like Malcolm Rifkin would be hoping that Biden would win the election if Biden were the Democratic candidate?
Well, it's the ultimate Hobson's choice, and I suppose to Malcolm, like many of our viewers and listeners, are kind of contemplating whether they can stomach the idea of the Donald for another 4 years, or indeed whether it's even feasible because of this court case, Michael. It's extraordinary what's playing out in the US. And later on in my show, I'm going to be speaking to Lanny Davis, who is the lawyer of Michael Cohen, who's obviously the man at the centre of this storm over Stormy Daniels.
Yes, well, I don't think this court case is going to resolve the matter. It seems really now to be part of Donald Trump's campaign. It doesn't seem to be doing him a great deal of harm. Malcolm Rifkin might be interested to know that on my show I'm going to be talking about the Stone of Scone, which is a stone that lies, that needs to be in the throne on which King Charles III will be crowned. But while Malcolm Rifkin and I were ministers, it was sent back to Scotland, having been pinched by the English in 1296. So we need to borrow it back again for the coronation. And we'll also be talking about Northern Ireland. And Camilla, I wonder whether you find Michelangelo's nude statue of David pornographic. Some parents in Florida do, and we're going to be discussing when is art degenerate.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Michael. No, I don't think it is pornographic. Good God, I mean, honestly, the things people complain about. Anyway, don't go anywhere, because we're going to get reaction from the People's Panel in St Albans, and I'm also going to be speaking, as I said, to Lanny Davis, the lawyer representing Michael Cohen, the man at the heart of the Donald Trump indictment scandal. Don't go anywhere.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities. especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. We're going to be speaking in just a moment to Lanny Davis, who is Michael Cohen's lawyer. He's at the centre of this Donald Trump indictment story that's been dominating the headlines all weekend, as is ever the case with the rather orange bleach-drinking former US president. But first, let's go to St Albans, where Catherine Forster has been with the People's Panel. I'm really intrigued to find out what they made of all of my interviews. Catherine, we've spoken to George Eustace, we've done sewage, we've done heat pumps. I've spoken to Malcolm Rifkin there at length about foreign policy. What's the reaction in St Albans?
Well, the People's Panel have got lots to say about all these issues, Camilla, but let's start with a certain Donald Trump. Andy, you have some thoughts on him.
Too old, too dumb, too corrupt.
My goodness, very succinct. And Steve, you're not a fan either.
No, I think he's bad for American democracy, and I think he's bad for America's alliances around the world, particularly NATO, so very much not in favour.
And you posed a question to George Eustace. Tell us what you thought about what he said about heat pumps and net zero.
Well, I thought it was interesting, and it was the first time I've actually heard a decent response. He mentioned a private member's bill, which will not require us to have heat pumps, but an alternative, a lower cost alternative. So I'd need to see the detail, but that was the most positive response I've heard so far. So, yeah.
And talking about net zero and the government's announcements and pledges, and also the, I'm not even going to try to say it, Camilla, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Alex, you're pointing out an irony in that, weren't you?
Yeah, although we really welcome a deal that will hopefully have a deflationary effect on food costs, there is a certain irony in announcing the deal with the Trans-Pacific Partnership on the same week that we're readjusting the net zero targets and ideally cutting to zero.
Lots of air miles involved potentially, aren't they? And lots of containers going across the oceans as well. But Andy, you have a broadly positive view of the new trade deal.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. It's what we should have had with Europe, but without all the strings and ties and all the bureaucracy, it's just a pure trade agreement. It's great.
So you think it will bring benefits to us? I mean, because it's been said, not very much in the short term, but you think it's well worth it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the demographic of the countries where they're going to be partnering with, they're going to be dying to buy all our fantastic British goods. So it's great for our exporters, great for our economy. Fantastic.
All very interested in hearing what Sir Malcolm Rifkind had to say, Camilla. And Steve, you were talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well and China regarding that. Tell us a bit more.
Yes, while I think it's a good thing overall, I do rather fear that it may be something of a hospital pass for the UK if we are the ones who have to block China's subsequent admission, because as I understand, there has to be unanimity among members for future members, and if we are the one that has to block China, then while that might not be a bad thing, it would bring us into conflict with them. And with the AUKUS deal already on the table over nuclear deterrent, then there could be two fronts in which we're in conflict with them.
Yes, and this partnership, of course, is about trade, but also about the symbolism and the soft power that we have, isn't it? Finally, obviously, we were talking before about the Conservatives and, Andy, where you felt they'd gone wrong, Rishi Sunak specifically. Steve, you voted for New Labour in 1997, but what do you think about Keir Starmer and Labour at the moment, and would you vote for them if there was a general election tomorrow?
I couldn't vote for Keir Starmer because I couldn't vote for anybody who had been in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. And also, I think that his only policy seems to be get into government. I don't think that he has any really credible alternative to the great problems that we face.
So there we have it, that even though Jeremy Corbyn has been thrown out of the Labour Party and will not be allowed to stand as a Labour MP in the next election, some previous Labour voters think that Keir Starmer is tainted by association. So a lot of work for Labour to do, even though they are way ahead in the polls. Back to you in the studio, Camilla.
Thank you so much for that, Catherine. Thank you to everyone in St Albans. I shall be in the town tomorrow, returning to where I was brought up, so lovely to speak to people there. Now, Lanny Davis, lawyer for Michael Cohen, joins me now. Lanny, thanks very much indeed for getting up so early over there in Washington to speak to me. Just for the UK audience, there's a bit of confusion, I think, about this being a criminal case now, this hush money that's been paid to Stormy Daniels and perhaps others. What exactly is Donald Trump accused of here?
So he's accused of what his former lawyer, my client, Michael Cohen, went to jail for. And that is, if you pay somebody money right before an election or with any political motivation in order to prevent that person from telling the American people information, in this case, an alleged affair with Stormy Daniels, that might have influenced voters had they known about it, that is a federal crime and probably a state crime as well. Why? Because the Southern District of New York, which are prosecutors in the United States, maybe the most prestigious prosecutors, accused Michael Cohen of facilitating that payment on behalf of his client, Donald Trump. And they said this is a serious crime because it deprives voters of the information that they need, and it's using money to hush somebody up. So it's a serious felony. It is a crime to do that. And Michael Cohen did the time. And the federal prosecutors said publicly that Donald Trump, they called him Individual One when he was president, directed Michael Cohen to do the crime. And Cohen did the time. He went to jail for that instruction. So the question in America right now is not politics. And I hear all of you talking about politics. In our courtrooms, our jurors, just as in Great Britain, and we follow the tradition, as you all know, the common law of England is what we follow. Only the evidence in the courtroom matters. So Donald Trump is going to have to explain in the criminal case, did he direct Michael Cohen to do this? And if Michael Cohen committed this serious crime, why shouldn't equal justice apply to anyone, including an ex-president?
And Lanny, what's yours and Michael's reaction to Donald Trump's talk of this being a witch hunt, this idea that lawyers and others in New York have been out to get him for years?
So this is the Donald Trump playbook. You notice there isn't a single fact in one of those words. he attacks and uses labels, but he doesn't understand facts. In fact, he doesn't understand the difference between facts and non-facts. And I say that as a Democrat who didn't support him, but I don't think there's a lot of dispute among people who work for him, known him for years, is that his attention span doesn't grasp facts. So what he's got to do in a courtroom, and he has no choice, unfortunately for him, is facts, evidence, that then 12 people called the jury will have to decide whether he's guilty or innocent. All the conversation and talking heads about politics may be a reality in the political arena, but when he gets into that courtroom, there are 12 people who are going to have to decide, is he telling the truth? And I think you know, whether you're a Trump supporter or a non-Trump supporter, that the truth is not a word that Donald Trump is very familiar with.
But is there not an argument to say that this has been quite self-defeating when it comes to Donald Trump's own presidential hopes second time round? We hear he's got another $4 million in the coffers. He wants his mugshot to be on his election posters. This has just given him publicity for the whole weekend and beyond that he could only have dreamed of.
So I'm really here to talk as a lawyer and about the case against Donald Trump and to explain to you this is about evidence and facts. It's not about politics, but since you asked, I'll answer. Remember, we have 2 elections in the United States, and there's a lot of confusion when even in your question. If you're saying, is he strengthened among his base of voters that I would say are somewhat fanatic and cult-like? Yes, he's very benefited by all of the language he uses, but that does not constitute a significant number of general election, meaning independent voters and Democratic voters. He's harmed by a continuation of his disregard of the law, of equal justice under the law. He was very much in favor of Michael Cohen going to prison, and yet the prosecutor says he instructed Michael Cohen to do the hush money. So equal justice under the law applies to independent voters who largely determine our elections, and Democrats as well. So when you say he's helped, yes, he's helped to get nominated. I have to say, somewhat not sure about this, that I hope he is nominated because he's the weakest candidate. As we saw in the 2022 midterm congressional elections, between presidential elections, the Republicans were supposed to take 60 or 70 seats in majority in the House. They only got 5, and everybody who Donald Trump endorsed lost because it was a general election. So remember the difference between primary elections, where the base votes, and that's where Trump is being helped, versus the general election to run for president. He's being harmed, which is why a lot of Democrats like me wouldn't mind him being the nominee.
Lanny, how many charges is he looking as if he's going to face? And will it ultimately potentially end his political career?
So first of all, I don't know. The grand jury in our system is secret until it publishes the indictment. An indictment is just an accusation. In our system, and I believe in the British system, Donald Trump is an innocent man until he is proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt by 12 people inside the courtroom, not by political polls, not by attack messages that he's so used to. So I don't know how many charges he faces, but I have read in the media that he has 20 or 30 separate counts of business fraud, as well as the felony of paying somebody to be quiet so that the American people don't have all their information before they vote.
OK, thank you very much indeed for that, Lanny Davis. It should be beholden on me to point out that, of course, Donald Trump denies all of these charges, but we will keep you abreast of the news going on in New York as it happens. Now, don't go anywhere, because we've got a tasty generation gap to come on, would you believe it, Just Stop Oil. Don't go anywhere. See you in just a moment.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even some ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now it's time for the Generation Gap. That's the part of the show where people from different generations debate hot political topics. This week we're going to be talking about Just Stop Oil. On Friday, the 6 Just Stop Oil protesters who disrupted the Grand Prix at Silverton last July were spared jail, with 3 given suspended prison sentences and a 3rd forced to pay a fine. Now, 5 of the protesters ran onto the track after a crash and sat on the track, managing to suspend the race. Cars were still being driven back to the pit lane as marshals and the police dragged the protesters away. So, is this sort of disruptive and dangerous process justified, or is it simply too dangerous? Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by Sean Irish, who is a Just Stop Oil protester, and Peter Blexley, who's a former police Met detective. Now, Sean, this Silverstone protest was complete madness, wasn't it? It nearly caused injury. We had marshals trying to sort the situation out. You then have, in all of your protests, a huge amount of police involvement that costs them time and hours. How on earth can it be justified?
So my name is Sean. I'm from the Just Stop Oil Coalition, and we were demanding that the UK government end new fossil fuel licences, and absolutely dislike all of our actions. Was thought out and planned. So we went on with a red light when it was safe. You know, we only took up half the road.
Is it ever safe to sit on a Grand Prix track?
Is it safe to do nothing about the climate crisis? That is the real question. You know, at the moment, our government is not doing enough. Their own net zero strategies have been deemed illegal. They've gotten rid of the Green Day and changed it to energy security because they know themselves that it's not a Green Day.
But our carbon emissions are 1%. So maybe go and protest outside the Chinese or Russian embassies.
Absolutely, and you should come with me. But domestic, we're talking about domestic production. This is the problem. So domestically, we produce 1% of the world.
But we're doing better, aren't we?
Define better. So all of our industries...
better than 50 years ago.
So but 50 years ago we produced our own industries. Now we don't. We've shipped our industries to China and India, and now we blame them for their emissions.
Should Just Stop Oil just find solutions to these problems? Your young generation of people who are now more connected with the rest of the world than ever, presumably because of all of the technological advances that have taken place, your generation, Sean, is absolutely primed to try and come up with some solutions. Instead, what you do is you spend your time gluing yourself to stuff. How does that help? Let's bring in Peter. What's the policing implication of all this?
Well, let me just make this clear. I am no climate change sceptic. In fact, I think it's a very important matter. And I'm a bit of a recycling evangelist, as anybody who parties around my house will tell you. That said, the Just Stop Oil protests have been very, very poorly thought out. In fact, there's been some numbskull, knuckle-dragging kind of tactics which have hoovered up a lot of police resources. Having said that, some of the police leadership has been woeful, lamentable and cowardly even, with a failure to properly enforce the law and to test stated cases.
What do you mean, giving a cup of tea to people like Sean gluing themselves to motorways?
Well, no, actually, obstruction of the highway, which is an offence under the Highways Act of 1980, says that willful obstruction of the highway in any way is an offence. But the Met Police in particular got themselves in such a tangle because there was a stated case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and there was a ruling that disruption had to be significant before the police could take any action. Well, Just Stop Oil were protesting day after day after day. That should have been an argument for being significant, and the police should have done more.
Sean, are you knuckle-dragging numbskulls?
I mean, absolutely not. You know, you said it yourself. We are the young generation. We're the most, the most educated generation. And you said we should be bringing solutions. The solutions have been around for decades. You know, we spend £200 million a week during a cost of living crisis, while people of your show cannot afford to feed themselves. We spend £200 million a week to the fossil fuel industry. You know, the only way you can build a wind turbine in the UK with tax exemptions if you own an oil field. You know, it's absolutely ridiculous to make an oil field net zero. You know, while we're not looking at solutions, we're not insulating British homes. And, you know, I agree with Peter on some level. You know, it's like, this is ridiculous that our government has brought us to this point, you know, and they're using, you know, the passion of young people for political gain, and so is the Met Police. You know, they're not enforcing the laws as they stand so that they can bring in new laws that can get rid of dissent, you know. And
Sean, and that is why, in so many regards, you have scored own goal after own goal. Firstly, you've alienated so many people because you disrupted people's everyday lives, and people were very resentful about that. Secondly, you forced the government to create more punitive laws against protest and disruption.
You just said it yourself.
Very quickly, Peter, and then let Sean
And
back
thirdly,
in.
Sean, a number of your people went to prison. 3 own goals. You need to learn the art of persuasion and do less protest.
Sean.
You know what, the art of persuasion is absolutely right, and you know what, the suffragettes should have known that. She should have just talked nicely. The queer rights movement should have just asked nicely, and the government would have granted it to them mercifully. We just know that that's historically inaccurate, Peter, and you know it's historically accurate. The reform that the police have been working for decades has been through activism within the police force, police standing out and taking action against the police force, talking about whistleblowing. Are you opposed to that type of action? They're not doing what they should do. They're not sitting in tightly. They're standing out and they're being counted, and you've commended them for that. And now you object me doing it.
Gluing yourselves to objects, roads, stopping people getting to very important hospital appointments, slowing down the economy by failing to allow people to get to work is really not the way to engage with the masses. Powerful, intellectual persuasion is the way to get a mass movement. You do not have a mass movement at the moment. You're a very small number.
30-second response from you on that.
Look, Peter, you know that's inaccurate. We have had intelligent conversations for decades. The IPCC reports, we have had scientists begging and pleading with the government, and the government have said, no, the fossil fuel donation, £100,000 every year to our party, we are not going to go against them. And that's the facts.
But does gluing yourself to the floor really make much difference to global temperatures? Final point, Sean.
Did standing in front of the King's horse help the suffragettes? We don't know until we see the change.
All right. Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there as time is upon us. Thank you very, very much for joining me this morning, Peter Blexley and Sean Irish. We will be back next week at 9:30. Next, we've got Michael Portillo, who, as ever, has got an absolute smorgasbord of guests for you. Please do stay tuned. Michael's on just a jiffy. Don't go anywhere.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Co.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes & Co. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my